Welcome to the Reality Taboo. It's March 15th, 2025. I'm Jeff. Joining me is my co-host, Ness. We've got a lot to cover today. We're going to get to as much of it as we can. First topic I've entitled, Where Did the Democrats Go From Here? So ever since Kamala Harris lost in November 2024 and Trump won, the Democrats have been licking their wounds, trying to figure out what's next. And there's been different approaches given by different factions within the Democratic Party. And so broadly, I'm going to split it into three of the biggest factions that I see, and each of them represented by one or more individuals within the Democratic Party. So first is the Gavin Newsom move to the center approach. Second, there's the Jasmine Crockett double down on black identity politics. And then number three, there's the Bernie Sanders populist attack the rich approach. So we're going to go through those one by one. We'll start with the Gavin Newsom approach of move to the center. And Gavin Newsom has started a podcast, and his first few guests have been interesting. His first guest was Charlie Kirk, who is a young populist conservative, very supportive of Trump, although importantly, when Trump first came on the scene, he was very anti-Trump. He was in the anti-Trump camp, along with many of the conservative Inc. types, such as Matt Walsh and Ben Shapiro. They were, to varying degrees, pretty virulently anti-Trump, and now they're all on the Trump train now. And so Charlie Kirk was on Gavin Newsom's podcast, and they had a pretty friendly back and forth. It was not contentious almost at all, and Gavin Newsom at least appears genuinely interested in trying to figure out what the Democrats need to do to win, what they can learn from the right, what mistakes the Democrats made. And then Gavin Newsom's next two guests were Michael Savage and Steve Bannon. And again, these are not, I would say these are not the safest, quote, right-wing conservative guests that Gavin Newsom could have had on. He selected relatively hardcore people. And so I'm trying to figure out what Gavin Newsom's angle is. Like I said, the obvious approach is he sees that the Democrats have gone too far on certain issues, too far to the left, and that he needs to move, that the party needs to move more towards the center. So he's trying to reach out. So Ness, what is your take on the Gavin Newsom move to the center approach?
Well, I don't know what we mean by moving to the center exactly. I think that based on the 2020 Democratic primaries, there is zero appetite among the Democrat electorate for that sort of strategy. That was the Michael Bloomberg strategy to a large extent, and it had no purchase at all among Democratic Party voters. That being said, the relationship between electoral support among the grassroots and who the Democratic Party ultimately nominates have not overlapped very strongly over the last couple of election cycles, to put it mildly. But I would assume that this is mostly a play. To get the attention that he's getting, he's bringing on, you were speculating about why he might be bringing on putatively hardcore right-wingers. I think he is bringing on people with a pretty established audience to try to boost his audience. I think those people who he's brought on are probably being used to goose his numbers early on with his podcast's initial launch. If you compare it to something like Michelle Obama's that launched this week that had views in the only 5 digits, I've looked, and Gavin Newsom is in the six figures, close to 7 figures on the downloads, and that probably is attributable to a large extent because Charlie Kirk has a big network. Michael Savage, although he's over the hill, over his peak, he was the second and third biggest talk show host a decade or two ago. And then Steve Bannon, of course, has a large following as well, and the followings of those three different guests don't overlap that much among the right wing of the population, broadly speaking. So there are a lot of ears that he was able to pull in that he wouldn't have been able to if he just went the route of bringing in the same types of people that would make the rounds on the Sunday talk shows on the Democratic side of things, on the left side of things. But I think ultimately what he's probably trying to position himself to be is someone who is a politician with a D next to his name that is deemed acceptable by the venture capitalist, Silicon Valley, new right, if you want to call them that, to put it in the elite theory terms that I've turned to frequently, that he is wanting to make himself palatable to the elite insurgency, and that is something that no other potential Democrat frontrunners are in a position to do or have the mind to do. So I think that is what he is positioning himself to be. But I think without the blessing of the Democrat National Convention and Committee, that he is not going to be able to simply by repositioning himself, put himself in a situation where he's able to win primaries. The Bernie Sanders relatively colorblind, we can go into the weeds on that. I think that was probably a little bit overblown. I think that's where Bernie Sanders' natural inclinations may have been a decade ago, but the Bernie bros of 5 years ago, up to the present, to the extent that they haven't been frustrated by his selling out, that they are not race blind. They have a lot of the same cultural instincts that an Antifa member does. But as far as positioning himself there, I think there will be more electoral purchase for the Bernie Sanders social democrat approach than there will be for the Gavin Newsom move to the center. But as far as the electoral strategy goes, the Jasmine Crockett route is the one that for the last couple of election cycles has proven to be crucial to getting the Democrat nomination. When Sanders looked like he was going to win the first three states in the Democrat primary in 2020, the rest of the field dropped out ahead of South Carolina, and James Clyburn organized the Black Get Out the Vote effort. And just as the Black vote decisively gave Barack Obama the Democrat nomination in 2008, when Hillary Clinton beat Obama among whites and among Hispanics and among Asian voters, among Democratic primary and caucus goers, Obama's ability to pull 85% of the Black electorate is why he won. And that's the same reason that Hillary Clinton beat Bernie Sanders in 2016, and it's the same reason that Joe Biden beat Bernie Sanders again in 2020. That to the extent that Bernie Sanders puts forward the race-blind, economically focused, class-focused, political conceptualizing, there is not very much support among Black voters for that. Black voters are reliable, consistent, establishment Democrat Party voters, and whoever the DNC gets behind is ultimately who they are going to get behind. And I think that will definitely not be a Bernie Sanders type, and I don't think it will be a Gavin Newsom type either. So I think that the most likely of the three directions that the Democrat Party goes would be in the Jasmine Crockett direction.
So to wrap up the move to the center, Gavin, approach, a couple other things I should mention. He did, I think the biggest newsworthy moment he made on the first few episodes was the one with Charlie Kirk, where he agreed with Charlie Kirk saying that men playing in women's sports is unfair. Gavin agreed. He says, yes, that is. It's a matter of unfairness. And he did get some pushback that I saw from the left. And another important fact to keep in mind in all this is he is in his second term as California governor. He is not up for re-election. He's term limited, so he doesn't have to worry about re-election. And then, of course, like Ness said, I mean, he is a heterosexual white male in the Democratic Party, so he's kind of got to take that into account as well.
It's worth noting that the approach of being the champion of the POC ascendancy as a heterosexual white man was a strategy that I think Joe Biden...
You mean pocket person of color? Is that what you're referring to?
Yes, person of color. It's plausible that Joe Biden was the last dinosaur who would be able to roam on that approach. And so the avenues for advancement to the top of the party, the presidency, to the White House for heterosexual white men has narrowed to either the Bernie Sanders direction or the neoliberal establishment's corporatized de-emphasis on hot button cultural issues. That Michael Bloomberg approach is the other of the two approaches remaining for Democrats. And it's not inconceivable that out of necessity, this directional change will occur. But if it does, it will signal a sea change in the political orientation of the Democrat Party, because go back and watch some of the debates from 2020 Democratic presidential primary debates, and I challenge you to find anyone who comes across as trying to tack to the center or sound like they are calling for a de-escalation in the culture war and focus on economic issues and focusing on reining in the military state to get rid of the guns and put more money towards the butter side of issues in a non-racialized, non-sexualized direction. And the only person who, maybe there were a couple that might come close to that definition. I think Tulsi Gabbard and Andrew Yang were the two who did, and they didn't even come close in the polls. They never cracked. Tulsi Gabbard never cracked more than like 1 or 2%, and Andrew Yang, even when it was down to 5 contenders, he was the polling the lowest, and his support was disproportionately from people who self-identified as political independents. So among registered Democrat Party voters, there is no appetite for that approach. It is either the racialized Jasmine Crockett approach or the social democrat Bernie Sanders approach.
I don't know if this provides any sort of indication of where the party's going, but a month or two ago, they elected the new chairs of the Democratic National Committee, and the chair of the Democratic National Committee is a white man, a heterosexual white man named Ken Martin. Moving on to the second approach, represented by Jasmine Crockett. So Jasmine Crockett is from in the House of Representatives. She represents a district in the Dallas area of Texas. She grew up in the St. Louis suburbs. She came from what I can tell, very intact, solidly middle-class family, professional black family. She went to private schools. She went to a nice college. She went to law school. And so her district in the Dallas, Texas area the racial composition is about 40% black, 36% Hispanic or Latino, 17% white, 3% Asian, and other about 2%. And so Jasmine Crockett first came onto my radar, and I'm thinking a lot of other people's radar, due to her spats with Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is a Republican representative from Georgia. And at one point during a House Oversight Committee hearing, Marjorie Taylor Greene said that Jasmine Crockett's, quote, fake eyelashes were interfering with her reading skills. And so in response, Crockett said Green had a, quote, bleach blonde, bad-built butch body. Miss Crockett's a very colorful lady, and I'm going to play a few sound bites to give you a little flavor of what she's all about.
I am tired of the white tears. If someone on this committee then starts talking about somebody's bleach blonde, bad-built butch body, that would not be engaging in personalities, correct?
A what now?
And I can promise you, it was my ancestors that built the White House. So listen, we are going to be in your face. We are going to be on your asses. So the only people that are crying are the mediocre white boys that have been beaten out by people that historically have had to work so much. I mean, this is very simple. We right now have a white supremacist that is sitting in the White House. He is backed up by other white supremacists. And if you really want to know who the criminals are in this country, you can Google it. You don't have to trust me. But the people that commit 80% of the most violent crimes in this country are white supremacists. Yet for whatever reason, they sit and they serve at the pleasure of the president. They are the ones that were there on January 6th, tearing our democracy down physically. And now we have them tearing us down right here from within. So let me be clear. Because you are a woman, or because I know that some of the right has been sharing these photos of the fact that I believe that the fire chief may be a woman or something, that has nothing to do with it. We are looking at qualifications. What diversity, equity, and inclusion has always been about is saying, you know what? Open this up. Don't just look at the white men. Open it up and recognize that other people can be qualified. And the fact that we want to, at a time when people are dying, decide that a country of immigrants is failing or people are dying because the same very people that built this country, because the last time I checked, y'all didn't say that anything was wrong with the White House. And I can promise you, it was my ancestors that built the White House. So listen, if we have been good enough to build this country, we are good enough to serve and die overseas, we are good enough to serve in other ways. And the fact that people actually decide that they want to engage in public service, whether it's sitting in Congress or whether it's serving on the fire department or the police department, should not be an issue. The fact is, stop trying to act as if only white men are the ones that are capable. Because right now you're sitting at a table with 3 very capable black women. What is happening?
So based on those sound bites, and I think those are pretty representative of her political brand, she is, like we said, she is doubling down on the sort of militant identity politics, DEI, woke approach to politics, in very stark contrast to the Gavin Newsom approach. In fact, it's hard to imagine Gavin Newsom and Jasmine Crockett existing in the same party, but that's the Democratic Party today. And so you may have scratched your head a bit when I started with a biography of Jasmine Crockett, solid middle class background, growing up in the mostly white suburbs of St. Louis, went to nice schools, an attorney. You might have thought then that contrasted with her aggressive demeanor. And just to explore that a little bit more, I have one more clip of her I want to play. So just to give some context, this clip juxtaposes 2 clips of her speaking. One is around the time when she was running or had been elected to her House seat from Dallas, Texas area. Then the other clip is not too long, maybe a year or 2 later, the other clip is her talking recently after Donald Trump had been sworn in to his second term. So these 2 clips are not that far apart distance.
First of all, it's good to see you in the new year. You know, no one could have told me that when I went down to Austin, now it looks like a little bit over a year ago, that I would be running for Congress. It's just not what my plan was. But what I've always decided is that I would step up when there was a need. Listen, he out there, he's hearing all kinds of nonsense and bullshit. Let me just be real. And we weren't gonna sit for that shit. We wouldn't, you know. But when she called me and said, I think it's time for me to retire, and you're the one that I believe should take my seat, I really was kind of caught off guard. I didn't anticipate that. If anyone knows anything about the Congresswoman, they know. We showed up, and if he had some sense, then maybe we would have been about that life. But y'all know he ain't got no sense. So please give some love. This took a little bit of coordinating to do, for sure. We got some cool shirts. You know, the congressional seat is over 4 times as large as my House seat. And I was just starting to get into the rhythm of doing constituent services and things like that. We got Madam Williams, who just happens to have the honorary seat. It's not even honorary because she's holding it down, y'all. But the legend himself, John Lewis, that is the seat in which she currently serves. So she honored his legacy. This is the message that she wanted to send today.
So changing the way you speak like that is known as code switching, and it's relatively common among the African American community. It's something that is a struggle among some Black people about how it kind of coincides or relates to authenticity and how much you want to be authentic to your background versus if you're a professional person like Jasmine Crockett is, an attorney, a member of Congress, existing in largely white spaces. How do you maintain your authenticity while also being effective in those spaces? And you can see that sort of contrast or struggle, or maybe just playing it both ways. It's just being blatantly, speaking one way in one scenario and another way in a different scenario. And it'll be interesting to see if Jasmine Crockett, as we'll talk about a little bit, if she has a future in a higher political office, how she's gonna which of those two approaches or demeanors she's gonna show to the public. And so Jasmine Crockett talks, obviously, as we heard in that clip, she's very focused on alleged white supremacy, and I'm sure believes that white privilege is a real thing and is a major problem in the United States. And I would pose the question, if that were true, if white privilege were real, why would she ever speak like she did in the ebonics-filled slang way she spoke? Wouldn't she want to exclusively talk in the way she did in the first clip? It's imitating more white norms. So I think the question answers itself.
I find it highly unlikely that Jasmine Crockett will successfully seek higher office. I would be very surprised if she even won a statewide office. This is pretty par for the course for the louder Black radical types. There are several House members that fit that general description. One was Bobby Rush, who is in, I believe, Illinois' 1st district, and that is the first congressional race that Barack Obama ran in 2000, and he got shellacked by Bobby Rush. But the approach that Obama tried to take was the same approach that he would ultimately take to win the Senate seat for the state of Illinois and then ultimately the presidency, and that is to be the well-spoken, articulate, clean, gassy, airy rhetoric that doesn't say much of anything. That's the approach that wins statewide offices and national offices. The kind of approach that Jasmine Crockett takes, even if it is in sync with the times, and I think culturally we're in a bit of a pulling back period from that. The wave is crested and it's starting to come back a little bit. I think ultimately we will push again in that direction, but for now it's receding to some extent. But even if it was pushing forward, even in 2020, 2021, I don't think the approach that someone like Jasmine Crockett takes will fly at the statewide level. As Jeff went through the demographics of her congressional district, that is a congressional district that demands or at least rewards that sort of approach. But statewide, she's not going to win a Senate seat in Texas given remotely free and fair elections.
So you mentioned James Clyburn earlier, he has said positive things about her, and I believe even indicated that she has at least a future in the Democratic Party. So I guess first question, would James Clyburn and his machine ever get behind her in a real way if she decided to run for president or even for a statewide office, let's say for the Senate in Texas? Would he get behind her? And then number two, would that be successful like it was when he got behind Joe Biden?
I don't know. I don't think that's a decision that James Clyburn is going to be making without being instructed to make it from a different source. I don't think he spontaneously got behind Joe Biden, say, in 2020, or got behind Barack Obama in 2008. Jasmine Crockett is probably too unpalatable to hit a statewide or national office. If you look at the various non-white candidates that the Democratic Party has tried to propel to the national stage in the last generation, none of them present with an approach that is like Jasmine Crockett's newly found approach. Now, she could take that code switching to such an extent that she is able to recast herself again in the way that she presented in her middle class or upper middle class upbringing as an articulate, well-spoken, friendly, gregarious personality. And the fact that there will be evidence of her sounding like she just came out of the ghetto as a hood rat, that exists, is something that is pretty easy to effectively scrub, or at least not have brought to the attention of the vast majority of the people who will be voting for her. And so that if she does reach higher heights in the Democrat Party as a forward public-facing member of it in a statewide or national office, I would be surprised if it was using the sort of approach that she has used as a congressional House member.
So Ness alluded to something that I'm going to make explicit when he mentioned Obama being characterized by some as clean and articulate. He was referring to an actual quote from Joe Biden. So in January 2007, then Senator Joe Biden described fellow Senator and presidential candidate Barack Obama as, quote, the first mainstream African American who is articulate and bright and clean and a nice-looking guy. And speaking of clean and articulate and nice-looking guys, we're going to talk about Byron Donalds just briefly. This is more of a side topic before we get to the third approach of the Democratic Party represented by Bernie Sanders. So I wanted to compare and contrast a little bit Jasmine Crockett with Byron Donalds. So Byron Donalds is a House representative, U.S. House representative from a district in Florida. So it's Florida's 19th congressional district. The demographics of that district: white 75%, Hispanic or Latino 18%, Black or African American 5%, Asian 2%, other/mixed 2%. So Byron Donalds is a relatively dark-skinned black man. So Jasmine Crockett and Byron Donalds on the surface maybe have a few things in common. They're both black Americans. They're both they're both in the U.S. House of Representatives, but their backgrounds are quite different. So Donalds grew up with a single mother in Brooklyn. His first wife was a black woman, and he divorced her when he got another white woman pregnant, and that white woman who he impregnated is now his wife. So Donalds, as a young man, had a couple run-ins with the law. He was charged with marijuana possession and intent to distribute, and then he was arrested on a felony bribery charge, to which he pled no contest, and then the charge was later expunged. And so he first, I would say, his real foray into politics was during the early Obama years. He jumped headlong into the Tea Party movement, and that was obviously opposed to the country's first black president, Barack Obama. And so at that time, Donalds was in his early 30s, and he started speaking at Tea Party rallies. And he was playing to an older and almost exclusively white crowd. And at a rally in 2010, he gave a speech on the back of a truck with a sign reading "No taxation with Marxist representation." And in 2020, when he was running for his current House seat, he said, quote, "Today, I'm everything the fake news media tells you doesn't exist. A strong, Trump-supporting, gun-owning, liberty-loving, pro-life, politically incorrect black man." And interesting, this is very current events. On February 25th, 2025, Donalds announced his intention to run for governor of Florida in 2026. The current governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, is term limited, so Byron Donalds will not be running against Ron DeSantis. And so obviously that's a pretty big contrast between Jasmine Crockett and Byron Donalds. And I think when I was reading about Byron Donalds, I was reminded of a theme we've talked about several times on this show, on the Reality Taboo, about class traitor and how there's a special contempt that, in this case, people on the left have for people who were Democrats or leftists in good standing who go to the other side, so to speak. So we talked about RFK, we talked about Tulsi Gabbard, we talked about Elon Musk, even Donald Trump. They were all associated with the left and are now in part of the MAGA movement. And there's a special, like we said, there's a special contempt that people have for those types who are seen as traitors. And I would say to a lot of people, a lot of black people in the United States, Byron Donalds is seen as a race traitor, a sort of Uncle Tom, in the same category as Clarence Thomas. And so I think this gives maybe a bit more extreme than the average statement on this topic, but I don't think it's cherry picking. I think it's fairly representative. This is a statement from Democratic Congresswoman Cori Bush, who, as a side note, interestingly, was recently primaried and lost largely because of her pro-Palestine stance against Israel, and there was a lot of pro-Israel Jewish money that flooded into that St. Louis, Missouri. Speaking of Missouri, where Jasmine Crockett grew up, but there was money that flooded into that district, and so as a result, Cori Bush is no longer in Congress. But getting back to her statement, so this is what she said. This is a tweet from her in 2023. Quote, "Byron Donalds is not a historic candidate for Speaker. He is a prop. Despite being black, he supports a policy agenda intent on upholding and perpetuating white supremacy. His name being in the mix is not progress. It's pathetic." And so here we have another black woman basically saying that Byron Donalds is a race traitor and betraying his people and is facilitating white supremacy, which, according to Jasmine Crockett, is responsible for 80% of violent crimes in the United States. So I would imagine that Jasmine Crockett doesn't have a positive view of Byron Donalds either.
If, as an aside, Crockett isn't merely pulling the 80% figure out of her backside, it could potentially, the way that she couched it, be in reference to FBI officially designated hate crimes, and that most of those hate crimes are classified as racially based, and they are, of course, very politically driven. That's a whole nother rabbit hole we could go down, but suffice it to say that the states that have the highest rates of hate crimes are very blue states like, well, here's a list of the top 5 states by incidents of hate crimes occurring in them. Number 1, far and away, with 4 times the rate of hate crimes as the number 2, is the District of Columbia. Second is the state of Washington State. Third, New Mexico. Fourth, Massachusetts. Fifth, New Jersey. And then an honorable mention to Vermont at 6th. The way that hate crimes are designated, they comprise less than 1% of the total crime that occurs that is categorized in the United States each year. And as mentioned, it is very politically and culturally driven. It's very arbitrary whether or not a crime is designated as a hate crime or not. And even with those parameters in place, blacks are still twice as likely as whites to be perpetrators in hate crimes, though the black perpetrated hate crimes, when they are categorized as such, almost always relate to crimes based on sexual orientation, and that is, to read between the lines, those are black men who think that they are getting involved with a female prostitute that turns out to be a male prostitute, and then they react violently, and it gets categorized as a hate crime, an anti-gay hate crime. So if we are very magnanimous and give the ultimate benefit of the doubt, maybe Jasmine Crockett is looking at the FBI statistics on hate crimes, specifically those designated as hate crimes based on race, and from there extrapolating that 80% of all what she characterized in the clip as extreme, quote, crimes are committed by white supremacists. But for those unfamiliar with the color of crime as it literally plays out in the United States, that's where memes like the 13 to 50 come from. Blacks commit over half of the violent crimes in absolute terms. That's not by rate. They comprise about 1/8 of the population, but make up more than half of all violent criminality that occurs in the United States. And it's also worth mentioning that black victims similarly are disproportionately the race of victims in violent crimes. That's probably neither here nor there, but it is an aside I didn't want to let go totally unchecked. Because on the face of it, the idea that 80% of violent crimes are committed by whites, period, let alone so-called white supremacists, is risible on its face. And before we depart entirely from that digression, I should note that the state with the absolute lowest reported level of hate crimes occurring in it, and this data is pretty old. I'm going back to 2007, 2008, because that was the data that I looked into at one point. But in that year, Alabama, the state of Alabama, had the lowest rate of hate crimes of any state in the entire country. And of course, the obvious response to that will be that, well, it's because those rednecks in Alabama, they don't report crimes that are clearly driven by racial animus against non-whites, especially against blacks, as hate crimes. That may be true, but if it is true, then it renders the entire hate crime category meaningless because the data going in is so flawed. And the idea that Washington, D.C. has something like 500 times as much hate crime as Alabama does in the way that it's officially reported scrambles just about everyone's circuits in terms of the narratives that they want to present with regards to hate crime and what it tells us about the state of the modern American landscape.
So now, returning to the main topic, we're going to tackle number 3 of the Democratic approach, the approaches that the Democratic Party could take. And so finally, we're talking about the Bernie Sanders approach. And I would call this the populist, slightly Marxist, socialist approach. So Ness referenced Bernie Sanders earlier, and Ness can correct me if I'm missing anything here, but my memory is that in 2015, 2016, when Bernie Sanders, I would say, first attained national prominence when he was running for the Democratic presidential party nomination against Hillary Clinton, he ran a relatively colorblind policy. He was de-emphasizing racial issues. He was focusing on class issues, trying to bring people of all racial backgrounds together and unite them under an economic agenda. And I would, in this case, or in his approach, you still have the Emmanuel Goldstein figure, and that's a reference to 1984, is basically the object of hate that you focus the plebs' attention on, the masses on. And so essentially every political movement has some sort of Goldstein figure. And so for Bernie Sanders, the Goldstein figure has always been the rich, the wealthy, the billionaires, the oligarchs. And interestingly, Bernie Sanders used to frequently not only criticize billionaires, but he also criticized millionaires. And in recent years, he's changed his rhetoric a bit on that, and he doesn't go after millionaires. He just goes after billionaires. And it doesn't take much imagination to figure out why that's the case, because old Bernie Sanders is now a millionaire, perhaps a multi-millionaire. And he largely due to his book sales. And he was actually asked about this in 2019. He acknowledged his wealth and stated, "I wrote a best-selling book. If you write a best-selling book, you can be a millionaire too." And so, yeah, since then his messaging is focused on billionaires. And so that approach Bernie Sanders still seems to be following. And he actually is in the midst of a nationwide sort of, I would call it a rally / town hall tour in some of the battleground districts and states that I guess some Democrats believe that mostly are held by Republicans, but that Bernie Sanders and other Democrats believe that are vulnerable to perhaps flipping the seat from red to blue. And he's calling it the Fight Oligarchy Tour. And so Bernie Sanders has the perfect foil, the perfect Goldstein figure today. It's, of course, Elon Musk and Doge. And so the level of vitriol and hatred directed towards Elon Musk has been escalating in the last month or two, to the point where I find it kind of funny that people, leftists, the epitome of the Tesla vehicle, electric vehicle owner is a white liberal, upper middle class, white liberal from California, and those are the people who are desperate to get rid of their Teslas. And so now they're trying to figure out can they get out of their lease, can they sell the Tesla. And I think that's just touches on another theme we've talked about on Reality Taboo about status over principles. So presumably these people, same Tesla owners, got a Tesla originally because they felt like it was good for the environment and that they were doing a noble thing and they were doing their part to tackle the existential crisis of climate change. But I think the fact that nothing's changed. If the Tesla was a quality vehicle and it was helping the environment a year ago, presumably it would still be the case that driving on wood would still provide those benefits, but they're getting rid of it. And I think that shows that it was never, at best, the environmental putative benefits that driving an electric vehicle like the Tesla conveyed was secondary to the status that was conveyed by having a Tesla. And so as soon as in those same circles in Silicon Valley, California, now that driving a Tesla is not a status symbol, it's seen in some hyperbolic view is seen as equivalent to like driving around the swastika. So it's no longer has high status. People are getting rid of it as soon as they can. And I guess the most charitable reading of that would be if those people who are getting rid of their Teslas are replacing them with other electric vehicles. Maybe you could say that's consistent. But so before I throw it back over to Ness, I just want to tee up a couple things. So I guess first, is it even true that Bernie Sanders de-emphasizes the racial elements? You were indicating earlier, Ness, that maybe I'm overselling that the colorblind nature of Bernie Sanders' movement, and particularly the Bernie Bros, his loyal followers. And then number two is if that were tried with a truly colorblind approach, de-emphasizing racial differences and trying to bring people together under common economic interests, is that even a viable strategy for the Democratic Party moving forward?
It's conceivable to me that it will be in the medium term, short to medium term, because as we've mentioned in previous episodes, I foresee severe economic struggles coming over the horizon quite quickly with the massive exploding goods trade deficit and the increase in the value of gold. Gold hit $3,000 an ounce in nominal term, in dollar terms, for the first time ever in gold's history this week. 5 years ago, it was at $1,800. an ounce, and at the turn of the millennium in 2001, it was under $300 an ounce. So if gold serves as a good barometer of the real purchasing power of the dollar, then in 25 years, in the span of a generation, it's not that we have inflation on the order of 25% or 50% over that period of time, annualized 2 or 3% a year, which is what the official CPI would have us believe, but that instead we've had a tenfold increase in inflation in terms of a reduction in the purchasing power of the dollar in just a 25-year span. And that seems to be accelerating now. The markets, the U.S. stock markets, have been going down. There was recently a record broken for the number of consecutive days that the Dow Jones Industrial Average was down. The Trump bump that came in the wake of the 2024 November presidential election that Trump won, all of those gains have been erased and then some. And that is all to the backdrop of the world's richest man quite ostentatiously and somewhat bizarrely going on and on about how he is going to take a chainsaw to these various government institutions and to cut through regulations to make businesses like the ones that he operates be able to operate more efficiently and bring the best and the brightest from across the globe here to work at lower wages than natives do. So if we have all of these things, a confluence of these factors happening at the same time, and they result in a big economic downturn, while Elon Musk is viewed to be tied at the hip to Trump and the MAGA movement, it would create, or it could certainly create, very fertile ground for a rebirth, a resurgence of the Bernie Sanders style of democratic socialist politics that he championed more in the mid-teens. And I think, for what it's worth, and I don't think it's worth that much, because I think ultimately he is like so many other politicians that will just do what he's told to do when he's told to do it. But I think his natural inclination is not to be one who champions racial grievance. I think Bernie Sanders does see things through a class and an economic lens rather than a racial or sexual or any other kind of cultural Marxist lens. I think he is more of an old school hard Marxist than he is a cultural Marxist. And so I think that could provide some fertile ground, but there will be the Jasmine Crockett's of the world who will try to leverage the cultural cachet they get from being part of the PAC ascendancy to take any power away from the Bernie Sanders types that they are able to take away. I think those two wings of the party are going to be the ones that are going to have more grassroots support, but the neoliberal establishment is going to prefer somebody like Gavin Newsom over either Bernie Sanders or Jasmine Crockett. I can't say definitively how it's going to play out, but I think those are some things to keep in mind. Right, that'll do it for us this week. Thanks for listening, and enjoy St. Patrick's Day, the closest that people of European descent get to being allowed to celebrate their ethnic heritage and have pride in who they are.